Well, good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and to see in you the possibilities of people who will take on the challenge of trying to help us have an economy, a technology that is in a harmonious cycle with nature. So today we have the ability to have access to energy. Each of you has access to energy. You can transport yourselves, you can be warmed, you can have light. There are all these things that you personally have access to. But when that happens, very frequently, the chemical process that allows you to get access to that energy actually puts carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and is then changing the temperature of the planet. So we would like to have the ability in the future to have access to energy in a way that doesn't do that so much. And my goal today in this presentation is to give you, the future, some tools for thinking about how you could design future materials for energy use that would be materials that could help deal with this problem. And we're going to do that by looking at some very basic ideas that are part of the core discipline of nanoscience. So we're going to take a look at that and see how we do. One thing I would like is a laser pointer. Oh, here it is. Okay. So we're going to use a core idea in nanoscience, especially if we get some photons out of here. Nope, no photons coming out of there. Well, we'll come to the photons later. Oops, there we go. Okay, so when we look at our energy landscape today, there are some very big changes going on. And two very big ones that just stand out if you are following what goes on a little bit in the energy space is compared even just to a few years ago, it is now possible to extract hydrocarbons from very hard rocks. Thank you. It's now possible to extract hydrocarbons from very hard rocks in ways that previously were very difficult to do. For example, just in the United States, that's resulted in a drop in the use of coal of more than 15% in 3 years, which has actually led to a significant reduction in the total carbon emissions, because when coal is burned, it's much less efficient, and so it's making a big change. The other big change that's been going on in energy globally is the huge drop in the cost of solar energy. Today, it's possible to get access to solar panels that are well below €1 a watt. Maybe 50 euro cents a watt for a module, something like that, which is starting to become cost competitive with hydrocarbons. And in fact, one way of measuring that is to say, how long does it take to offset the energy of production? And it turns out if it costs you a certain amount of energy to make a solar cell, how long do you have to run the solar cell to get all that energy back? The answer is about 1.5 years, a little bit less than 1.5 years right now. But you can run the solar cell for 25 or 30 years. So you see you get a lot of energy back from it. So it's growing very, very dramatically. But in fact, what we would like to learn how to do is to make that even more so, to use the hydrocarbons even much better, and also to make solar energy much more efficient. And today I'm going to show you, I won't talk about the efforts to try to make better use of hydrocarbons that we're engaged in. I'm instead going to talk with you about an idea that I'm kind of excited about at this moment because it's an idea I didn't appreciate until about 2 years ago. So I'm very excited about it right now, and it's an idea for a different way to make a solar cell. So we're going to talk about that. And at the same time, we're going to talk about a little personal journey that I've been involved in of trying to make materials which could have different kinds of applications. And so you'll get a little feeling for what that little journey has been like for me. So let's start with the heart of nanoscience. Very simple idea here. This is the one thing I'd like you to take away from this. Imagine that you have a piece of gold and you chop it in two. and you say to your friend, please look up on the internet the properties of this piece of gold. What temperature will it melt at? What is its density? How well will it conduct electricity? Okay? And you look those things up, and you'll find them all listed there. There's the properties of gold. And then you take it and you chop it in two again, and you say, look up the properties. Well, you would say, they haven't changed any. All I did was cut the piece of gold into two pieces, right? And so it's still gold. But in fact, if you take that gold and you chop it in two over and over and over again, down to the point where it's only a piece of gold that's 100 atoms across, or 50 atoms, or 15, or 10, okay? If it's that small, just a few atoms across, in fact, every property that you could look up about gold on the internet will not be correct anymore. All the properties, the melting temperature, they'll be different. And they'll change in a very, very systematic way according to what we will call a scaling law. So I'm going to show you in action 3 quick scaling laws. And once you've seen those scaling laws, I think you will be in a position yourself to start thinking about how you might design a material yourself that could have a beneficial property. So melting, let's take that. That's the simplest example. The melting temperature tells me how strongly all the atoms hold on to each other in a crystal. If you like, if all of you lock arms with each other, okay, you'll be held together into a lattice, okay? And now if you start bumping each other, you could come apart and become a liquid, okay? And the stronger you hold each other, the higher your melting temperature. But if there's only a few of you, 5 or 6, it would be a lot easier to pull you apart than if there's millions, okay? And that's what happens, in fact, with crystals. All the atoms are holding on to each other, but if the crystal becomes small enough, the atoms at the surface have nobody to hold on to on the other side. And as the crystal becomes smaller and smaller, the melting temperature decreases. And this is a really big effect. You can see it here, a dramatic drop by a factor of more than a factor of 2 in the melting temperature of a crystal as it becomes small, and it only has, here it might have several thousand atoms in it, maybe 10,000. Here it might have only a few hundred. And when you make that change, you see the melting temperature drops dramatically. That turns out to matter a lot because it means I could make a solid-state material by a very simple chemical process in a liquid. And in fact, today it's possible to take materials which previously would have been made by a very, very sophisticated process that looks quite complex and make it instead in a great big vat, just in the way it would in a big chemical plant, because that solid material melts at a lower temperature. It's easier to make. So that could have a very big impact for us. It means that with tiny crystals, we can make them quickly and inexpensively. Here's another scaling law. Just quickly, you need 3 of them in order to do all the design experiments. So the second scaling law that we're going to work with, it concerns actually making a perfect crystal. Now, you have not yet had this experience, probably. Some in the audience have, particularly the ones up in front, but some, have not. And this one concerns whether you can make something perfect or not. So if you go to the jewelry store and you try to buy a diamond, you'll find in operation a scaling law, which will be like this. Every time you look at twice the size of the diamond, the price will go up by a factor of 4. So if you have 1,000 euros to spend on a diamond, okay, and you look at one and you say, well, I'd really like one that's twice as big, they'll say, I'm sorry, that one's 4,000 euros, okay? You can't afford it anymore all of a sudden. So there's a scaling law. Why does that happen? That's because making a diamond perfect takes a long time. Why? Well, because the diamond, if it has a defect in it, if a crystal is growing and there's a defect inside, it's kind of stuck inside there, slowly, slowly, it will work its way out to the edge. Think about earlier, we have all of you linking arms, and somehow one of you maybe is much bigger than the others. So now there's a spot where there's no room for somebody else to join their arm. That's a kind of a defect inside that crystal. And that person's got to sort of slowly worm their way to the edge of the group to push out to the edge. And maybe there, this bigger thing can hang out there, okay? Then you would have pushed the defect out to the edge. You can imagine that there's going to be a scaling law for that. In fact, the time to anneal a defect out will scale exponentially with the volume. So if you want a crystal to be perfect, it takes a long time. That means that it's rare. That means that it's expensive. Well, it turns out for nanoscience, we turn that upside down on its head, and we say, well, if I can make a crystal that's only 10 atoms across, it will take almost no time for a defect to anneal out to the edge. So I can get a crystal that's perfect for very little money. So again, if I make my materials on the nanoscale, I can make them very inexpensively and have them be of very high quality, essentially almost perfect. And that's in fact what is seen very often. An example of that is if we take a crystal and we press on it, like in the center of the Earth, we find that it can change its shape, and then when we release the pressure, it can go back again. And that can go back and forth many, many times. And that's something which can't happen in a bulk crystal. That's seen, for example, one of Dick's colleagues at Stanford is working on making batteries by that kind of mechanism. Instead of having, when a lithium ion goes in to charge a layer of graphite or an iron phosphate or something, it goes in and the volume changes when the lithium ion enters into the anode material. The volume changes. Well, in a tiny crystal, those volume changes can be absorbed very easily. In a big crystal, it leads to cracking. So we want to make our battery material out of something very small. Okay, so those are two scaling laws. Melting temperature and the structure of a nanocrystal can be highly perfect. Let's just do the third one, and then we'll be all set to jump into solar cells. We have here the example. This is a trickier one. It's a little bit trickier. Imagine that I have now a solid material with all these atoms inside it, and one bond breaks. What do we mean by one bond breaks? Well, light comes in, it zaps one of the people holding arms together, and now they lift up their arm. They're not holding each other anymore, okay? And now that excitation, that region where there's no bond anymore, can move through the crystal. So the two people link again and they raise their other arm, and then that sort of passes through and you get these that sort of broken bond can move its way through the crystal. That's how conduction takes place inside a semiconductor material. It turns out that actually in a crystal like a semiconductor material, those electrons are not so localized at one bond. They spread out over about, 1,000 atoms. So if a photon comes in and it breaks a bond, that bond excitation is spread out over thousands of atoms. And now, if I make the crystal smaller and smaller, that entity is spread out over fewer and fewer atoms, and as that happens, actually, the energy goes up. That's a scaling law called quantum confinement. You can also think of it like this. The electron is a wave. If you've learned anything about little quantum mechanics in your classes, the electron is a wave. And when that wave is confined to a small volume, it increases in its kinetic energy. And that increase in the kinetic energy shows up as a change in the color of the material. It's like what's shown here. These tiny crystals can now be made in high quality, very perfect. They emit light very beautifully. And in fact, a first application of these from some years ago was to take these crystals, which are just a few nanometers across, they're the size of a protein molecule, and place them inside cells where they could be used as biological labels. And so, in fact, we can make these fluorescent labels to stain different parts of biological specimens, and there can be different colors based on the crystals being different sizes. And one thing which is very important is that in these so-called quantum dots, that electronic excitation is spread out over thousands of atoms. Now, why is that important? Here is a conventional organic dye, And here is one of these little crystals. And what you see is that the conventional organic dye bleaches. So if I go to stain a sample with a dye molecule, it has now a color. If I keep irradiating it, it gets bleached. Just like if you have a fancy t-shirt, you leave it out in the sun for a long time, it can get bleached. But this nanocrystal does not bleach. The reason for that we can understand because that electronic excitation, in the case of the molecule, is distributed over a few tens of atoms. In this nanocrystal, it's distributed over thousands. And so the localization is reduced. This one is very susceptible to chemical damage because the excitations are so localized. Here, it's a little bit more spread out, that energy, so it can't cause any kind of damage or decay. So it's a more stable kind of entity. Now, that shows up. We're about to get to solar energy, just a moment. We're getting there. Now, in a quantum dot emissive film, so here we have those dots. They're made in a chemical factory like the one I showed you. They're highly perfect. They emit light of different colors, and there are green and red dots embedded inside this film, and then that film is inside a tablet like the one I'm about to show you here and pass around. And so in this tablet, there's some blue LEDs, and those blue LEDs excite this film, which is embedded inside here, which then makes these colors. I'll just pass these around, and you can see some photos which I took on a vacation, and you can see the film and the display. And so let's take a look at that. There's this display of that has in it these colors. And what's important to note is that these colors, if you look at them carefully, you'll see they're somewhat nicer colors than the ones that you would get from your conventional display. They have a redder red and a greener green, and so they just look nicer to your eye. Okay? So that's a good thing. That means that these quantum dots now have a kind of application. Skip this part and go straight now to the solar energy application, okay? And then we'll wrap up. So here's a story. We've been making these materials for a while, and I said to you at the beginning, I really wanted to have some impact on solar energy. And Dick mentioned to you earlier how sometimes things don't go quite the way you planned. So one of our next speakers, Richard Friend, is one of the great inventors of different ways of making nanoscale materials to harvest energy. So years ago, I was reading some of Richard's seminal papers and those of some other people who are mentioned on here, and I thought, wow, maybe we could use our quantum dots to help for getting solar energy. And I followed some of the ingenious approaches there. And then I had a moment of doubt. We were sort of heading down this road, and it just got to be hard. And, well, what especially got to be hard was that we knew we needed to get a very high efficiency for power efficiency and a very low cost. And I started looking at our little quantum dot systems, and I started making a list of all the things that they had to do in order to be able to harvest the energy correctly. And this is now almost 10 years into this business of trying to make solar energy devices with the quantum dots. And one day I just got very discouraged, and my students noticed that I had gotten discouraged, and they're working on this project. There's nothing worse than you can do, than to be sitting there feeling a little bit down. Professor, you're supposed to be there excited. But the problem was that we took these charges and we put them inside a box. It's called a quantum dot because it's a box that seals electrons and holes inside really well. And for the electrical problem of solar energy, I need to pull the charges out again. And that's tricky. I think we do know how to do that eventually. But then one day I'm sitting there looking at this display that's circulating here, and I'm thinking to myself, well, why am I trying to fight what works? Why don't I take the fact that these guys luminesce beautifully and try to use that instead? So here's an idea for how to do that, and now I'm feeling like, wow, maybe this could work. So, one thing that people like to do with solar energy is take mirrors and focus the energy down very, very tightly. So could I do that with luminescence? And how would that work? And would it be better or would it be worse? So I'm now going to just show you, last thing here, a little bit about how it could be much better. Don't know that it will, but it could be much better. It's a very close collaboration with Ralph Nuzzo at the University of Illinois and with Harry Atwater at Caltech. So here we go. You're now going to learn something, I hope you'll remember this, photon entropy. At the very least, you can say some very complicated words to people and feel good about it. So if I take this laser beam and just imagine, you can see that it's a dot. It leaves my hand here and it proceeds like this dot. So all the photons that come out of this thing are moving in exactly the same direction. Okay? That turns out to be a very ordered state. Imagine that I take that laser beam and I aim it at a cloud. It's got mist. There's lots of air, and the photons will get scattered all over the place. So now they will be pointing at different angles. That's more disordered. Now, if I went outside and had a laser beam hitting like that, and then I tried to imagine, well, could it ever go the opposite way? Could I ever have all the light scattering around, and then suddenly they would just spontaneously all go in the same direction? Well, the answer is that won't happen unless I put extra energy in to make the photons all go in the same direction. Okay? I have to expend energy to make that happen in order to reduce the entropy. And it turns out when I have a molecule that absorbs light and then emits it, there's an energy gap between the absorption and the emission. So this is getting energy into the molecule. This is the energy coming out. And in a conventional molecule, those two things are just linked by the molecule itself. But in a quantum dot, as I will show you in a minute, I can separate those two things. So I can make the gap between the absorption and the emission as large as I like. And it turns out, if I pay that penalty of having a bigger gap between the absorption and the emission, then I can use that to concentrate the light. What does that mean? That means I have a plate. Inside it is a material that absorbs light and then emits, and the plate is a waveguide, so any light that the molecule emits gets sent along that axis, and if I do things right, light comes from every which way, but the luminescence will all go down and funnel down to a spot. So I'll have taken random photons and organize them to all go in one specific location. And I'll do that by designing a quantum dot material that has exactly a certain Stokes shift that I need. In other words, I'll have the energy available to do the concentration. And I can kind of go through some of these numbers. I won't do that here because I don't want to take too long on it. But in principle, I can make a concentrator that will do that and that will have that property. Now, how can I do that? The way I can do that is by making a funny material in which I have one material that absorbs the light, that's this yellow material here, and another material that emits it. So this is a core shell quantum dot, one that absorbs light and one that emits, that are connected to each other, so that any energy that gets absorbed by this region gets funneled down into the central one, which then emits it. So for example, in this case, I have an absorbing material of 25 nanometers diameter. That's going to be 100 atoms across at least, and then a little core material that's only 2.8 nanometers, so there'd be almost 1,000 times more volume of this yellow material than the red, but all the absorbed energy will then get emitted by that little red one there. And these two have different band gaps. One is a bluer band gap, and this one is a redder one, so that makes the Stokes shift. I can tune that to be anything that I want. So when I do that, there's one more thing that I have going for me with my quantum dots, which is a bit of a detail, but I will place this film on top of a dielectric mirror that transmits high energy light, but always reflects the light that the quantum dot emits at. And a small detail here, it has to do that at every angle. And because the quantum dot has a very narrow emission spectrum, that's why the colors are so beautiful in that display, because the greens, reds, and blues are very specific energies. So I have a very narrow emission spectrum from the quantum dot, which again comes because the energy is spread out over a certain volume. I can have this mirror, and my quantum dot emission at all angles will be inside that mirror, so I can spread the light around. Now, we haven't quite got this working 100% perfectly yet, but this was the record for a luminescent concentrator. It had achieved a concentration factor of 10. What does that mean? That means that if I illuminate an area like this with sunlight, all the energy gets focused down to a region that's 10 times smaller. That would be the literature record. To be really interesting, I need a concentration ratio of 100. But in our first device that we've made, we've already achieved 30, which is 3 times more than the record that had ever been made previously. So we're on a good track here, and I'm very optimistic that one of these days we're going to make a luminescent concentrator, and we'll even go a step beyond and we'll stack them so we can have red, greens, and blues. And if we can do that, we actually have a real shot at getting a high efficiency and a low cost with these materials that can be made in big vats. And they'll look like a chemical process, very perfect crystals again, all by the use of those scaling laws. And so what I'm going to do now is just go back to this slide and then just wrap up there. So I think what you've seen is just a little bit of a personal journey. We made these small crystals and studied their scaling laws, and at first they had applications in biological imaging, and then finally in displays. And today we're trying to figure out if they could have an application in a luminescent concentrator. And then one day, I'm pretty sure we're still going to figure out how to get charges in and out of these things to make a regular solar cell or other types of things where the charges are moved in and out. And the key thing to remember here is that at every step of the way, we try to use certain very simple scaling laws in order to design the materials. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. This was quite exciting, I think.
Good.
And we see some ongoing work here. It's not quite finished yet, but it's well on its way. So any questions for Paul, please?
This one.
There, yes.
My first question is about the biological applications.
Yes.
Can you use quantum dots to replace the conventional dyes that we use in medicine right now, so that you can, like, put a quantum dot in a molecule, and you can track the
Yes.
The location of the molecule in a body or an organism. Is
Yes.
it possible that way?
Yes. So it's a great question. So the question is, can a quantum dot be used to replace an organic molecule dye for tracking inside the body? So the answer is yes and no. Quantum dots are available commercially. People can buy them. They do about 10,000 researchers a year buy them. And if you have, for this purpose, for tracking biological things, and the big advantages they have is they have very specific colors, so you can have multiple different ones, and they don't bleach, so you can follow them for a very long time. You can follow things that go on, and they'll last. The biggest medical application, most of it is for biological research. The biggest actual medical application is actually in pathology. If for some reason, if you go to a hospital and they do a biopsy, they take a little piece of tissue out and they want to test it to see what's going on with it. Very, very frequently, it will be labeled with quantum dots in order to see what kinds of species are present on the surfaces of the cells, and to tell you whether there's a benign or a malignant tumor and so on. Many, many tumors are imaged that way today. But in terms of putting it inside an actual human being, not yet, because these materials are not really friendly necessarily to biological specimens, or that isn't a proven out issue one way or the other in a definitive way. And so they don't have any kind of approval to be put inside a person. And probably the composition of materials that we can make readily today won't get that anytime soon. So there's an effort to try to make quantum dots that would have the same spectral properties, but be made out of elements that are known to be more friendly. And that's still ongoing. So the answer is yes and no.
My second question is about the application in solar panels. what will happen on a cloudy day? Because you said that, you know, if in principle, if you should use quantum dots in the building of solar panels, it absorbs light from every direction and then concentrates it in a particular point.
Yes.
What happens on a cloudy day when there is no sun?
Yes.
Will it absorb light from, you know,
yes.
maybe a street light or something like that?
Yes,
and then
this is a truly excellent question. Well, I'll just answer it without going back to the slides, but excellent. Thank you very much. So, for many reasons, people like to do this business of concentrating the sunlight, even with a conventional electrical solar cell, because when you concentrate the sunlight down with a mirror, you can have a very small solar cell that can be very, very, very efficient. And in fact, when the intensity goes up of the light, certain properties of the material become better. So many schemes involve geometric concentration. You take a mirror and you concentrate it down. Now, it turns out, if you think about the sun, it's very far away. So even though the sun is big, from the point of view of optics, it's like a point source. It's like just a little point. And a conventional concentrator will take a geometric mirror and take the point source of the sun and focus it down to a point on the solar cell. Geometric concentrator will do that. But, as you just pointed out, many days are cloudy. So a conventional concentrator cannot concentrate that light at all because it's just diffuse. The luminescent concentrator that I just showed you actually really doesn't care. It will take the point source and focus it down, and it will also take the diffuse light and focus it down equally well. So, in fact, it will take the cloudy light and just funnel it all down into this one spot where the high efficiency, electrical solar cell is. And the main thing that it will do is it will take a great big area of cheap stuff and use it to collect the light onto a very tiny area of the expensive electrical solar cell. But it will work equally well with diffuse and point source light, which is quite different than a conventional concentrator. So it's a great question.
So are we looking forward to a new quality in picture when it comes to, TV and, I don't know, movies or something like that? Are we looking forward to a hoodie? How long is it coming?
For those displays, they make very beautiful colors. And the product that you saw going around was the first commercial product that really had them in there. Hopefully, in coming years, it will be in many, many, many products, and it will enable these color purity to be higher. That's something, one would like to have very high color purity. In other words, if you look at what colors your eye can distinguish, you would like to have a display that can reproduce all of those colors. And the phones that we're all carrying around, in fact, do a very poor job of that. They can't quite get the green and the red to be good, greens, reds. The blues aren't so bad. So the quantum dots could enable that. There are some other approaches to doing that. And in the next, 5 years or so, there's going to be a big race of several technologies to try to be the one that will produce at large volume, at low cost, very high color purity, without compromising battery life, and so there's a lot of different things that have to all work. So what I showed you is one idea for that I have my fingers crossed is the winning idea. So but we shall see, right? That's part of the adventure. There's no guarantees, but it's the joy of trying to make that happen. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions here? There's one, please.
So, if you succeed in creating these new solar cells that can absorb this focused light, how much more efficient would it be compared to the solar panels used today?
Yes. Okay, very good question. So how much better can this get? So here's an interesting point, that if you were to look at 5 years ago, this is how things change. So you're trying to take the best you know about science and how to design things, and then where technology is. And things can change on you. So 5 years ago, a silicon solar cell would have cost about, let's say, approximately $5 a watt or so. And $1 a watt was thought to be kind of a threshold. If you could get below that, then it would make an enormous difference. And in fact, that's what's happened. A silicon solar cell is now 65 cents a watt or something like that, maybe even a little bit less. So the price of that has dropped enormously, and it has a power efficiency of about, let's say, 18 to 22% kind of range, typically. So that sets a bar then. Anything interesting has to significantly exceed that. So to be really interesting, it has to be really, I think, at this point, at least 30%, if not over that. But it still can't cost more than that $1 a watt. So that's what's a requirement. Now, it turns out that the thermodynamics of solar energy works out that if you have a material, remember, a photon comes in and it produces an electronic excitation. That's quantum mechanics in action, by the way. That's Einstein's Nobel Prize. Did you guys learn the photoelectric effect? Photon comes in and it kicks an electron out. That is, one of the great discoveries of all time that can happen. In a solar cell, the photon comes in and it stores a certain amount of energy across the band gap of that solid. And there's an optimum for that. And if you make a perfect solar cell out of that, it will have an efficiency that's around 30% power efficiency if a single gap is perfect. To do better than that, you need to stack different band gaps, a red, a green, and a blue, and collect those each separately. And in that case, the limit is up much higher, maybe twice the 30%, even a little higher than that. So in principle, if we made these red, green, and blue layers, and we designed them very carefully, and we married them to the collectors just right, and we kept all the costs down, our target would be to try to get to well over 30%, more like a 40-45% efficiency solar cell, but still have it be low cost. So you can see there's a lot of ifs along the way, but that's the adventure, and we'll find out in the coming years if we can do it or not. That's going to be a challenge for us to try to achieve that.
Well, I don't see any. There's one question, so let's take the last one.
One problem with the solar cells today is that the concentration of solar rays are much more concentrated in Africa, Sahara, or close to the equator of Earth.
Yes.
Up here in Sweden, the light is not so much concentrated; it's more spread out over a bigger surface.
Yes.
Will this type of luminescent cell be able to compensate for that?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I didn't have time to go into this. There was another section of this talk where I would have gone into that sort of issue. So thanks. This audience is really hitting all the points here, okay? So okay, good. So actually the biggest issue in solar energy right now is not to, I'm telling you about an idea we have to get to much higher efficiency and low cost and so on, and I'm excited about it. But, if you just sit calmly and look at all the facts and you're not tied to any specific thing from advance, what you would say is the biggest issue in solar energy right now is how to store the energy. And we can see that, for example, in Germany, where there's an enormous amount of solar energy. You see every day on the power grid, the solar comes on, and then it goes off at night, and it comes on, and it goes off at night. And there's these huge swings, and you're having to turn on and off other power sources to make all that managed right. And as you just pointed out, there's the discrepancy across the face of the Earth in terms of energy might be used more in places that don't have as much illumination and so on. And then there's the issue of winter and summer. So the solar has all these variations. And for this region, one of the biggest goals is to learn how to store the solar energy in a good way. And one way would be to do it with batteries, but I think a better way ultimately would be to do it chemically. So we make electrons that have high energy, and then we take those electrons and we use them to rearrange chemical bonds and to make a fuel. And I believe that's the right answer for how to store the solar energy. And it's a wonderful research topic because nobody's quite figured out how to make that work perfectly. but there are lots of indicators that it is possible to do that. So that's a whole other topic. How do we take that electrical energy now and convert it into a chemical fuel, which would store the energy very densely and allow it to be transported, held over seasons, used during day and night, and so on. And that's possible to do, but it's going to be a challenge for your generation to take the scaling laws and cleverly find a way to make that all work to store the energy.
Well, I think we've had a great discussion, and thank you for your questions. And let's thank Paul again for an excellent lecture.